If your parents abandoned you for 10 years, then suddenly showed up at the funeral just to claim $50 million, what would you do? I still remember that night like it just happened, the night my entire life changed. I was 10 years old, curled up in the back seat of a beat-up blue station wagon, clutching a frayed lion plushie I named Leo. The sky was unusually quiet, dark with a soft purple glow from the distant city lights. I wasn't scared. We were on our way to Grandpa Walter's house in Asheville, and that always meant safety. He'd welcome me with a tired but genuine smile, offer me warm biscuits straight from the oven, and wrap me in one of his oversized flannel shirts. His house was full of old clocks and jazz music. It felt like a different world, one where I was wanted. But that night, something felt wrong. The car rolled to a stop on the gravel driveway, headlights cutting through the mist. I waited for my mom to turn and reassure me, to tell me we'd be inside soon. But she didn't. She just sat there, staring ahead like she couldn't move. Her hands clenched the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. Dad didn't say anything either. He hadn't spoken the whole ride. Just stared into the night like there was something out there more important than me. Then, finally, Mom turned toward me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just for a little while, Harper. Be good, okay?" That was it. No explanation. No hug. No tears. Just a little while. I nodded. Of course I did. I didn't know what else to do. I grabbed my small backpack, just a few clothes and Leo, and opened the door. Grandpa Walter was already on the porch, his eyes full of worry and something else I didn't understand back then. I turned around one last time. "Mom?" I called, just loud enough for her to hear. The car started to reverse. No wave. No goodbye. I took a few steps toward them, heart pounding. The red tail lights disappeared into the trees. I didn't cry. Not because I was brave. I just didn't know yet what it meant to be left behind. Grandpa pulled me into his coat and held me there for a long time. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and old wood. He made my favorite, tomato soup with grilled cheese, but I couldn't eat. That night, he read me a story about a girl who found her own way in the forest. His voice was steady, calming. But I wasn't listening. When the lights went out, I curled up under the same patchwork quilt I always used, Leo tucked under my chin, ears straining for the sound of a car engine. All I heard was the wind. The next day, I waited by the window. 1 hour. 2. All day. They never came back. And they didn't come back. Until the money did. Every afternoon, I sat by the window, watching each car that passed. My heart leapt at every engine hum, only to sink again when it wasn't them. 2 months. My parents still hadn't come back. At school, when my classmates talked about family vacations or what their moms packed them for lunch, I just smiled and stayed quiet. I'd stopped asking Grandpa Walter when they were coming back, because somewhere deep down, I already knew. They weren't. My brain had accepted it, I think. But my heart? It never caught up. At night, when the house settled into stillness, I'd slip under the covers and bury my face in Leo, the little lion plushie I couldn't sleep without. I'd bite my lip to keep the cries silent, not wanting Grandpa to hear, not wanting to be a burden. Still, sometimes, he'd quietly push open the creaky bedroom door, sit on the edge of the bed, and rub slow circles on my back. "It's not your fault, Harper," he'd say gently. "Some people just aren't meant to be parents. Doesn't mean it has anything to do with you." I wanted to believe that. Really, I did. But how could I? When the silence they left behind was louder than anything? When the same question echoed over and over in my mind, why didn't they choose me? Grandpa Walter wasn't the kind of man to throw around big speeches or grand gestures. But he loved me, in the quiet, steady way that never needed to be proven. He showed it in warm dinners waiting on the table, in fixing the loose step on the porch, in never once badmouthing the people who walked away. His house was old and creaky, not like the shiny places on TV, but it always felt solid. Safe. He still drove his ancient Toyota pickup, despite the way it rattled and coughed up hills. His walls were lined with shelves filled with thick, dusty books, mostly history and old detective novels. And every morning, without fail, he read the business section of the newspaper like it held secrets to the universe. One morning, while I stirred my cereal, I asked, "Why do you read that boring stuff?" He folded the paper and looked at me with that quiet smile. "Because knowledge is power, kiddo. If you know how money works, you never have to beg for it." I just nodded at the time. But those words stayed with me, more than I realized. Slowly, I adjusted. I stopped staring out the window, waiting for a car that would never come. I learned to rake leaves, bake cornbread, and prune the scraggly roses out back. I learned to stand on my own feet, even when they still felt a little shaky. Most of all, Grandpa made sure I never felt forgotten. He was the first to see my love for science. One rainy afternoon, he found me in the kitchen, completely absorbed in a fizzing mess of baking soda and vinegar. Foam poured over a mason jar, bubbling like magic. He leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, a grin tugging at his lips. "Looks like we've got a scientist in the house." I looked up, startled. "I was just trying something." He chuckled. "Well, keep trying, Harper. That's how you change the world. Experimenting is the best way to learn, Harper. But if you want to build something bigger, let's do it right." That's what Grandpa Walter said after I nearly ruined the kitchen with my volcano of foam and vinegar. The very next day, he took me into downtown Asheville to a cozy little bookstore that smelled like old paper and cinnamon coffee. He let me roam the kids' science section and told me to pick whatever I liked. I ended up choosing a book about chemical reactions and a small starter experiment kit. He never said no when I asked for more books. Never once made me feel like something was too far out of reach. By the time I was 13, I was knee-deep in a project that studied how bacteria responded to different temperatures and pH levels. While other kids were binge-watching shows or playing video games, I was charting results, recording patterns, and losing sleep over hypotheses. When the North Carolina State Science Fair came around, I almost backed out. I was afraid of failing, of not being enough. But Grandpa wouldn't let me talk myself out of it. "Success doesn't mean you never fail," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "It means you keep going, even when it's easier to give up." Those words carried me through. I showed up, trembling but determined. And I didn't just participate, I won first place. Standing on that stage, the lights hot on my face and the trophy heavy in my hands, I scanned the crowd. When I spotted Grandpa in the back row, arms crossed, lips twitching into the smallest, proudest smile, I knew every late night, every doubt, every lonely moment had been worth it. Still, even with all that growth, some things didn't change. I stayed quiet when classmates mentioned their parents or family trips. I'd stopped asking about mine years ago. Because I knew. I knew they weren't coming back. My mind accepted it. But my heart still hadn't made peace with the echo they left behind. At night, when the house went quiet and the clock on the wall ticked into the dark, I'd curl up under my covers, burying my face into Leo, trying to hold back the sobs. Sometimes, Grandpa would walk in, silently, like always, and sit at the edge of my bed. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. He'd just rub slow, comforting circles on my back and say, "It's not your fault, Harper. Some people just aren't built to be parents. That doesn't mean you weren't worth loving." I wanted to believe him. Desperately. But some nights, the question still echoed louder than his comfort ever could: why wasn't I enough? Grandpa never gave big hugs or emotional speeches, but he showed love in every quiet moment, in perfectly crisp grilled cheese sandwiches, in early morning newspaper readings, and in never once speaking poorly of the people who left. His home wasn't glamorous, but it was safe. Familiar. Honest. Just like him. And in that quiet strength, I found the beginnings of my own. I just nodded back then, not realizing how much those words would shape me later. Living with Grandpa Walter, I slowly built a new rhythm for my life. I stopped staring out the front window, hoping to see a strange car pull into the gravel driveway. I stopped listening for an engine that would never return. He taught me how to bake buttermilk biscuits from scratch, how to prune roses in the backyard garden, and most importantly, how to pause and think before letting emotions take over. More than anything, he made sure I never felt alone, not even on the nights I cried quietly into my pillow, heartaching for people who had long since disappeared. He was also the first one to notice my curiosity, my love for how things worked. One afternoon when I was 9, he walked into the kitchen and found me totally absorbed in a bubbling mess of vinegar and baking soda. Foam spilled over a coffee mug and onto the counter while I scribbled notes in a little notebook. He folded his arms, tilted his head, and chuckled. "Well now, looks like we've got a scientist in the house." I looked up, cheeks burning. "I was just messing around." "Experimenting's the best way to learn, Harper," he said. "But if you're serious, let's do it properly." The next day, he drove me downtown to a cozy bookstore near Pack Square. He told me to head to the kids' science section and pick out whatever sparked my interest. I chose a colorful book about chemical reactions and a beginner experiment kit. After that, he never said no when I asked for more. He never treated my dreams like they were silly or too ambitious. By the time I turned 13, I was fully immersed in a science project analyzing how bacteria behaved under different environmental conditions. I spent hours at the library, poring over medical journals I barely understood, testing and logging results in notebooks stacked high on my desk. When the state science fair rolled around, I almost didn't go. I was terrified of failing. Of embarrassing myself. But Grandpa wasn't having it. "Harper," he said, his voice calm but firm, "success isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up when you want to quit." Those words carried me through the doors of that convention center. I didn't just show up. I won. As I stood on stage holding my trophy, the applause echoing off the walls, I searched the crowd. My eyes landed on Grandpa in the back, arms crossed, pride glowing in his tired eyes. That moment, it meant everything. But then I saw them. My parents. Standing near the staircase, looking like they belonged. 1,000 emotions crashed in at once. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand why now, after all these years. But I kept it in. I just stared. My dad stepped forward, voice soft and practiced. "We know this is hard. We know you're hurting, sweetheart. But you don't have to go through this alone. You're coming home with us." The words hit me like ice. "Home?" I repeated, my voice sharp and disbelieving. My mom reached out, brushing my arm. "You're still under 18. You're still our daughter. And now that Walter's gone, you need your family." "Family," I said, a bitter laugh rising from my chest. We stood there at the base of the stairs, the air heavy. But I didn't move. Not an inch. I looked at them. Their faces wore that same rehearsed calm I'd seen 100 times in strangers trying to sell something. But I wasn't that wide-eyed 10-year-old anymore. I wasn't the kid they left on a porch without so much as a goodbye. I knew exactly why they were here. It wasn't for me. It was for Walter's money. I stared straight into my dad's eyes. "Are you here because of me, or because of Grandpa's will?" Silence. My mom blinked, just for a second, a flicker of hesitation breaking through her polished expression before she quickly masked it again. My dad stepped forward, his voice suddenly full of weight, like it was supposed to mean something. "Of course we're here for you, Harper. We're your family." I didn't blink. "You really believe that?" They didn't answer, so I did it for them. A real family doesn't dump their kid and disappear for 3 years. A real family doesn't only come around when there's something to gain. My voice didn't waver. For the first time in a long time, I felt solid. "I'm not going anywhere." My mom's smile cracked into a glare. "Harper, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're your parents. No, I said, locking eyes with her. The only real family I had is gone. The words caught in my throat for a moment, but I didn't cry. Not this time. Because in that moment, it all clicked, I didn't want anything from them anymore. They had walked away once, and I was never giving them another shot to do it again. The conference room was cold, quiet, the kind of silence that pressed on your skin. I sat at the head of the long wooden table, fingers curled tight in my lap. Across from me, a man in a crisp gray suit straightened a folder and cleared his throat. Walter's lawyer. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me was numb. Another part was exhausted. But more than anything, I just wanted it to be over. My parents sat on the other side of the table, calm and collected, on the outside. But I saw the hunger behind their eyes. This wasn't about me. This was about the number they thought was waiting. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and looked at me. Harper, I'm Thomas Green. I handled your grandfather's legal affairs. I'll be reading the will. I gave a small nod, keeping my face blank. No emotion. No invitation. He opened the folder and began, his voice steady. I, Walter James Whitman, being of sound mind and acting of my own free will, hereby declare this my final testament. My heart twisted. He listed small gifts first, donations to the local library, money for his church, a check for the animal shelter. But when he reached the final line, his tone shifted. All properties, investment portfolios, bank holdings, and personal assets, totaling approximately $52 million, are to be left in full to my granddaughter, Harper Lee Whitman. Silence. The room stopped breathing. My parents froze. My mom moved first, bolting up from her chair, eyes wide and full of disbelief. That's impossible, she gasped. There has to be some mistake, my dad added, voice dropping into something cold and sharp. This isn't how it was supposed to happen. We're his children, he continued. We're entitled to that inheritance. Thomas Green didn't flinch. Calm and professional, he simply slid a folder across the table toward them. I'm afraid neither of you have any legal claim to Mr. Whitman's estate. He tapped a document sitting on top of the stack. Roughly 3 years ago, both of you signed this, voluntarily relinquishing all guardianship rights over Harper Whitman. His voice didn't rise. He didn't need to raise it. Every word landed like a hammer. Ring a bell? My mom's skin went pale. That was just paperwork. We didn't mean. This is a binding legal document, Thomas cut in. When you signed it, you gave up all rights. Not just to guardianship, but to anything your child might legally receive in the future. I stared at them. I wanted to see regret. Maybe a flicker of shame. A realization that they'd thrown away something precious. But all I saw was panic. Bitterness. My dad clenched his jaw, his voice cracking. She must have been manipulated. There's no way he'd leave all that to a kid. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Walter was exceptionally precise. He reviewed this will multiple times, with 3 separate legal advisors. No one manipulated him. No one had to. My mom's fists clenched in her lap. We're still his family. We deserve at least a portion. No, I said. Their heads snapped toward me, surprised that I'd spoken. But I didn't flinch. My voice was stronger than I expected, calm, but full of something I hadn't let myself feel until that moment. Power. You don't get to show up after 3 years and demand anything, I said. Family isn't just DNA. It's who shows up. It's who stays. I reached up and touched the small silver key hanging on a chain around my neck, Grandpa Walter's last gift. His key to the old lockbox in the study, where he kept the letters he wrote me over the years. The ones he never let my parents read. You left me, I said. And now I'm leaving you. My mom's eyes narrowed, fire burning behind them. Harper, you're just a child. You don't understand. If you don't share with us, there will be consequences. I laughed, hollow and tired. Consequences? You think I'm afraid of you now? You already showed me who you are. I've learned something valuable. I don't need people who only come around when there's something to take. My dad slammed his hand on the table. You'll regret this. Before I could reply, Thomas leaned forward. You're welcome to challenge the will in court, he said coolly. But I assure you, every word in that document is airtight. You won't win. Their faces twisted, frustration, rage, defeat all swirling in their eyes. They knew it was over. Finally, my mom stood up, her face hard as stone. Mark my words, Harper. You might have all the money, but you'll never have a real family. I looked at her, something shifting deep inside me. But it wasn't fear. It wasn't even pain. It was freedom. I stood tall, adjusted the chain around my neck, and said clearly, I did have a real family. You were never part of it. Then I turned and walked out of that conference room without looking back, because I knew I'd never need to see them again. At least, that's what I thought. I figured the drama ended with the will, but I underestimated just how far their greed could stretch. A few weeks later, Thomas Green, Grandpa Walter's lawyer, called. They filed a formal lawsuit, he said. They're challenging the inheritance. No surprise. They were claiming Walter had been coerced into rewriting his will. Said he wasn't mentally competent in the last year of his life. That a 13-year-old couldn't possibly manage an estate of that size. I wasn't rattled. Because Walter had planned for everything, like he always did. We had documents. Medical evaluations confirming he was of sound mind. Signed statements. Witnesses. The will had been revised and reviewed multiple times, all properly filed. There was nothing they could exploit. The judge dismissed the case almost immediately. I thought that would finally be the end of it. I was wrong. That afternoon, I was at Whitman Holdings, the business my grandfather had started from scratch. His name was etched in gold on the glass doors. I was sitting in his old office, the chair still a little too big for me, going over some reports with the company's interim board advisor when the front desk rang. Miss Harper, the receptionist said, voice tight. There are 2 people downstairs claiming to be your parents. They're demanding to see you. I closed my eyes, exhaled slowly, and set my pen down. My stomach clenched, but not from nerves. From sheer exhaustion. I'll come down. When the elevator door slid open, I straightened my spine. I wasn't that crying kid left behind on a porch anymore. There they were, standing dead center in the lobby, drawing stares from every employee walking past. My mother had her arms folded tight across her chest, her expression locked in impatience. My father stood beside her, stiff, like a man who'd already decided how this conversation was going to go. The second they spotted me, they moved in fast. Harper, my mom said, her voice lined with that same manufactured concern I remembered from years ago. We need to talk. I didn't budge. I crossed my arms and stood my ground. Talk about what, exactly? My dad stepped in. His voice was heavier, more commanding. We can't leave things like this. You know that. I let out a short laugh, cold and hollow. Like what? The way you both left me behind and never looked back? My mom's jaw tightened, but I didn't flinch. Watch your tone, Harper, my mom snapped, her voice strained and brittle. I know you're upset, but this isn't just about old wounds. This is about family. About what's rightfully ours. I raised an eyebrow. Ours? What makes you think you have a right to anything? My voice was steady, calm. Too calm. You didn't come back to make things right, I said. You came back for the money. My mom blinked. She didn't deny it. My dad leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as he dropped his voice into something low and sharp. If you won't cooperate, we'll take a different route. I tilted my head, unimpressed. Different how? He tightened his fists. We could go public. Let the media hear about a spoiled teenager cutting her own parents out of their inheritance. People eat that stuff up. I let out a short, dry laugh. Is that a threat? I didn't move. Didn't blink. Go ahead. Share your version. Then I took a step closer, my voice softening but cutting sharper than ever. Tell them how you left your kid at 10 years old without a single word. Tell them how you tried to rob your own father of everything he built. They both flinched. Tell them how, in over 3 years, you never once checked if I was okay, if I was even alive. And now that Walter's gone, now you crawl back, thinking you're owed something. My mom's glare faltered. My dad's jaw twitched. But I could see it, not anger this time, but fear. Not fear of me, but of the truth. Because they knew once it was out there, once the world saw who they really were, there'd be no coming back. My dad looked away first, muttering something under his breath. My mom stayed quiet for a moment longer, maybe waiting for me to back down. But I didn't. I didn't move an inch. Her voice dropped. Remember this, Harper. You might have the money, but you'll never have a real family. I didn't even flinch. I looked her straight in the eye. I had a real family, I said. You just weren't part of it. Her mouth twitched, but she said nothing. She turned and followed my father out the glass doors of Whitman Holdings, out of my life. For the last time. And as I stood there, watching them vanish into the daylight, I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel empty. I felt free. For years, I'd mourned the idea of a family I never really had. But now I saw the truth clearly. I hadn't lost one. I had one, Walter. Later that day, I stepped into his old office. The one I hadn't touched since the funeral. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting gold across his polished desk. Everything was still in place, the ledgers, the old fountain pen, the tiny porcelain teacup on the shelf, and the framed photo of him on the wall. His eyes still looked just as I remembered, sharp, kind, and quietly proud. Watching over me. Still. In front of me sat a small wooden box, carefully placed on the desk like it had been waiting for me. On top was a sealed envelope, my name written in the familiar curve of my grandfather's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. To my dearest granddaughter, Harper. His words felt like his voice was still in the room, calm and steady as always. If you're reading this, then I'm no longer with you. That breaks my heart, because I never wanted you to feel alone. But even if I'm gone, I'll be watching you, every step you take. His writing was shaky in places, but still elegant. I traced the words with my fingers, like touching the paper would somehow bring him back. You've always wondered why your parents left you, and I know that question has weighed on your heart. The truth is, they didn't just walk away from you. They tried to take everything I built. When they realized I wouldn't let them, they chose to disappear. But I never regretted what came after. You, Harper, were the greatest gift they left behind without even realizing it. Tears welled in my eyes as I held the letter close to my chest. I'm not just leaving you wealth. I'm leaving you a legacy. I founded the Hope Foundation years ago to help children who've been abandoned or forgotten, kids like you once were. Quietly, behind the scenes, I used my resources to give them a second chance. I blinked hard, my throat tightening. You have the strength to keep that mission alive. You always have. You're brave, smart, and full of heart. Don't let the past define your future. Use what I've left you to do good, in whatever way feels right to you. At the bottom, written in bold letters that stood alone. I have always believed in you, and I love you forever. The tears came, silent but steady. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into learning everything I could about the Hope Foundation. The office was tucked away in a modest building Walter had quietly purchased years ago. That's where I met the team, people who had stood beside him all this time, without asking for credit or recognition. One of them, Maria, a kind woman with gray streaks in her dark hair, gently took my hand one morning. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "Walter always believed you'd come here one day. He said you were the only one who could carry on his vision." Her voice wasn't emotional, it was certain. I looked around the office, walls covered with smiling photos of children, shelves filled with reports on their progress, and letters from those who had once been lost but were now thriving. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," I admitted. Maria gave a quiet smile. "You're here. That's already something powerful." And in that moment, I knew I would make it work. Alongside running the foundation, I also stepped into Whitman Holdings, the company Walter had spent decades building. At first, no one took me seriously. I was 13, a kid in their eyes, someone who'd stumbled into wealth. But I didn't let that stop me. I studied constantly. I shadowed meetings. I asked questions no one expected me to understand. I worked longer hours than anyone else on the floor. Every time I felt doubt creeping in, I remembered Walter's words, "Knowledge is power." A year later, I stood in front of the board, pitching a strategy to expand the firm's investments into social impact ventures, projects that didn't just make money, but made a difference. And as I spoke, I saw it, something shifting in their faces. Respect. Recognition. I wasn't just a girl who inherited a fortune. I was a leader. Sure, I could have bought anything I wanted. But I kept Walter's old Toyota parked in the garage, a little dusty now, but untouched. Because it wasn't just a car. It was a symbol. Of humility. Of purpose. Of a life built on values, not wealth. I wasn't just carrying his money. I was carrying his beliefs. His vision. I wasn't just his heir. I was his legacy. Life doesn't always deal us a fair hand. But how we respond, how we choose to rise, that's what defines us. Harper had been abandoned, underestimated, and tested. But she didn't let that story finish her. She rewrote it. Because the most powerful legacy isn't what we keep. It's what we give. If you've made it this far, I just want to say thank you, not just for listening to my story, but for standing with me. I know I'm still young, and I've still got so much to learn, but I also know this: we get to choose what kind of story we write from the pain we've lived through. I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever had to stand up to someone who should have loved you but didn't? Leave me a comment below, not just for me, but for someone else reading who needs to know they're not alone. And if you're going through something hard right now, abandonment, betrayal, feeling like no one sees you, here's my advice: don't wait for someone else to come save you. Find your strength. Build your future. You don't need their permission to become something greater. I didn't win because I was lucky. I won because I refused to stay broken. So, whatever you're facing today, let this be your reminder: you are not what they left behind. You are what you choose to rise into. I believe in you, just like Walter believed in me.